Fantastic. Well, it's great to be with you all on behalf of Rhoda and indeed the whole Agerbak clan. So this is taken on our family holiday last year. And so for those of you who don't know me, Ella on the right there is 23. She's off at uni, a year to go, and God willing, she will be a doctor, which will be very exciting. She now has a hoodie that says doctor to be, I think. Or doctor in preparation or something like that. Izzy is also off at uni, and Alice is about to go. So this September, God willing, she'll be off as well, so please pray for her choices. And then Toby's gone to mountain movers, is I believe the correct terminology. I am instructed not to use the phrase preteens, but mountain movers. So he's excited to spend time with Mulligan and Bethany and others. I had the privilege of sharing a TED Talk just two Tuesdays ago, which was a fun experience. It was a bit scary, knowing it was being live streamed to the whole universe. The thing I found hardest about the whole experience was I'm used to talking in church, and I'm used to talking at work, and suddenly I'm speaking to a mixed audience. I know there's going to be Christian friends listening, there's going to be family listening, there's going to be work colleagues listening, clients, and just the wider. And it's quite a challenge to figure out how to present things that are important to me, like my faith, in a way that's going to be accessible to people from very different backgrounds. But a lot of people spoke to me and said the topic I shared about was sort of, is work-life balance achievable? And spoiler alert, I said that's the wrong question, which is a classic thing a consultant should do, is reframe the question. And said that I thought any sane person looking at my life would not describe it as a balanced life, but I would hope they might describe it as a passionate and a fulfilled life. And several people said they found that helpful, people from all those different kinds of backgrounds. And so preparing for the message today, I thought, well, what's a more scripturally rooted way of talking about similar questions? Because we all live busy lives here, right? Many of you got families, work, you've got many, your students here, you've got exams coming up, you've got many responsibilities. We're called to be Christians who live life to the full. Our lives are full indeed, and yet it's sometimes easy to feel like spinning all the plates, and several of the plates are wobbling, and maybe one or two have got dents from previous falls. And I thought that Abraham and Sarah are a great couple to look at as a couple in the Bible who live passionate, fulfilled lives through, very eventful, events in their life, and I thought that might be encouraging. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about a passionate, faith-fulfilled. And we'll start in the book of Genesis in chapter 11. And to save me getting a crick in my neck, I'm going to turn to that as well. So it's in Genesis 11, verses 31 and 32. Electronic Bibles can be slower. So Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set off from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there, and we'll stop there. So it's a short passage. But normally when we start the story of Abram, we start in chapter 12, which continues immediately after this verse, and that's God's call to Abraham to leave the place he's come from and go to Canaan, to go to the promised land. But I think it's instructive to start the story here because we realize that Abram was not the first in his family to be called to go to Canaan. His father Terah was also called to go to Canaan. And they got quite a long way on the journey. So I don't know how well you can read this, but so this is Mediterranean, Israel, and is down here, which is in southern Iraq in modern day geography. And in fact, you can find artifacts from It's been excavated in the British Museum. There's gold jewelry. There's a board game that's sort of roughly similar to backgammon. There's, they've excavated it, and it's quite it's a place that has two-story buildings. It was, an established, reasonably mature civilization. So it can't have been easy for Terah and for Abraham and their families to leave their established community. And they traveled about 600 miles up to Haran, which is apparently just near the border of Syria and Turkey, so where there's a lot of conflict going on at the moment. So it's about a 600-mile journey. So about 600 miles to get up there, and then it's about another 600 miles or so, another 500 or 600 miles, on foot. Maybe they had donkeys or camels or whatever to help carry some of their stuff. But that's a long way. You can imagine if you're able to go maybe 10 or, if you're very bold, 20 miles with a family in a day. That might be 30 days, 30, 45 days, a couple of months journey. And the Bible says here they settle in Haran, and for the Bible doesn't say why, but Terah gives up on his dream. He's been called by God to go to Canaan. He gets halfway there, and he settles. And that's my first point, is don't settle halfway there. Don't settle halfway there. And, I think it's easy sometimes to settle. It's easy to give up on our dreams. And I can imagine, we don't know exactly why Terah gave up on his dreams. We do know that he had a son called Haran who died. And sometimes, when you have a bereavement, when you have something tragic like that happen to you, it can really knock your faith. It can be, devastating if something that you believed was God's plan and God's will for your life doesn't turn out the way you hoped and wanted it to be. And perhaps some of us have had, bereavements or precious plans and dreams that didn't turn out the way that we hoped it would. And the fact that the place is called Haran is perhaps because Terah named it that after the son that he had lost. But Abraham and Sarah could have used that as an excuse themselves. They had their own disappointments. They were not able at this point to have children. Abram's name means exalted father, so he was clearly expected to have children, and yet even at the age of 75, which is about how old he was when he was called by God to go, he hadn't had children, and presumably they would have given up on, or been tempted to give up on, the hope of children at that stage in life. For Sarah, being childless, would have been particularly challenging in that society. Being childless was assumed to be the woman's problem, even though, we know today biologically it can be for all sorts of reasons. So they had significant setbacks in their lives that they themselves could have used as a reason to give up on their dreams and plans. And later on, as for those of you who know the story of Abraham and Sarah well, they have other setbacks. They arrive in Canaan ultimately, and having arrived, there's a famine. And it would have been, they must have thought, well, God, we followed your plan, we did the right thing, we left behind where we need to go, and suddenly you brought us to a place where there's no food. How is that your plan? And they have to go down, as you see in the diagram, down from Canaan down to Egypt, and they wait there until the famine has passed before coming back up again. And along the way, they have, some setbacks. Abraham is afraid that Sarah being an attractive woman, as all of our wives are, that that she's going to be taken advantage of, or he might be maltreated on behalf of her. And so he lies to Pharaoh and says, Sarah's my sister. He later does the same thing again to Abimelech, another king. And, it can be hard for wives when husbands are less than perfect and don't stand up for us. It can be hard as husbands to recognize you're not quite the man of faith that you would like to be, to lead your wife, to lead your family some of the time. It would have been easy for Abram and Sarah to let those setbacks damage their faith, and yet they continued on, their more than 1,200-mile journey, and they refused to settle halfway there. There's definitely been times in my life when I've been tempted to settle and to give up. Rhoda and I became Christians at the age of 19 when we were students. We graduated at 22. We got married young, which was wonderful. If God brings you the right person at the right time, then seize the opportunity. We went off to Sweden, to go on a mission team. We were going to, join a mission team to go and start a church in Copenhagen. But after going there, I found the transition of new country, new relationships, new married life, new everything, much harder than I was expecting. And I struggled with sin. And it must have been very challenging for Rhoda to see her husband struggling. And we ended up coming back to London, and we're very grateful to people like the Partingtons and the Blows and others who patched us up and helped us get strong again. And then a few years later, in 92, we were sent out on another mission team to Oxford, and that was a great adventure and great journey. And I'm grateful to this day for the things that God did while we were there. But we never quite got to critical mass. It was a team of 3 and then 6, and then ultimately about 15 or so. But it never quite got to critical mass. And 4 years later, we reluctantly decided to move back down to London and have a fresh start. And since then, since 96, we've been, in London, in and around Wembley, Harrow area. We've had the privilege of serving with many different hats. And, we've had wonderful times. We've had challenging times. And there have definitely been times when we've been tested and tempted. Our middle daughter, Isabel, not doing well in her faith over the last year has been far and away, the biggest test and challenge for me in my faith for many, many years. And decided to step down as an elder, connected with that was also hard, although her faith is far more important than any hat that I wear. But it's staying faithful through those ups and downs is a real challenge. It's tempting just to settle at some point and think, okay, God doesn't have a great plan for my life, or I've messed up, or circumstances are against me. And I think sometimes God does want to reshape and redirect our plans. Some of the things I wrote down of my career aspirations or other things have been fulfilled in very different ways than how I originally anticipated them. So I think it's humble to recognize that God sometimes wants to take us in a different direction, but it should still be a faithful direction. It should be a step that glorifies God, where we don't cling on to don't cling on to the comforts of home, but we're willing to be used to do great things. Whether you're young or whether, like Abraham, you're 75 years old. Don't know if there's anyone who qualifies here in the room. Don't think so. But some of us closer than others. But I have a couple of questions for you. So, in what ways have you settled in Haran? Have you given up on dreams that God had given you? Have you settled for mediocrity? It's easy sometimes just to get into habits. Sometimes good habits, sometimes not so good habits in relationships, in marriage, in family, in our discipleship, in our ministry. It's important to allow God to wake us up from time to time and remind us of the dreams and plans that he had for us. And I think it's inspiring to see Abram not allow himself to settle in Haran, but to go on to achieve his dreams and through those ups and downs. I mentioned Abraham lying to Pharaoh. I think it's also good from time to time to say, well, how am I doing with my integrity? Are there things that I'm not being open about? One of the biggest reasons to lose faith is when we know we don't have a clear conscience. It's hard to be faithful when you don't have a clear conscience. And, deciding to be open and honest with God, deciding to be open and honest with your spouse if you're married, with one or two close friends who have strong spiritual convictions. I think those are great things to do to make sure that we keep a clear conscience and don't settle halfway there. I sat down with Isabel. I got most Sundays to have dinner with her, and being an impoverished student, she's very happy to have someone come and buy her dinner. And we have some great talks. And last Sunday we had one of the best talks we've had in a long time. And she said, Dad, I want you and Mum to know that I want to do the right thing, and I want to know how what you think. She says, I always know what Mum thinks. I don't always know what you think. And I think I'm even though Rhoda's more English than me, biologically, I think I have the Englishness of being less forthright, transparent. Sometimes I dance a bit around the bush. And Isabel said to me, I want to know what you think about my life, about the choices I'm making. And I was very grateful that she, invited me into her life, because I've had felt there were some areas of her life that was, no-go areas, difficult to talk about. And I was extremely grateful that she was inviting me into that part of her life. And I recognized, I'd because of the hurt in our relationship over her faith decisions, I had settled for a lack of closeness and intimacy in talking about matters of the heart. And my own fears and nervousness about going there had prevented me from having those conversations, even though actually she was quite willing to have them. I'm grateful that she said that, but it could easily have been the case that she didn't say anything, I didn't say anything, we went on, me thinking like, well, at least we're having dinner together, but not going the extra step to say, well, would you like to pray together, or can we talk about your faith, or can we talk about other aspects of her life. So I'd like to encourage you in your family relationships and in your spiritual relationships in church to not settle for mediocrity, to be willing to go outside of the comfort zone, to really connect with each other in the heart areas, to have the conversations we need to have to help us be faithful. Secondly, keep your focus on the big things. So you'll probably know that Abraham is given this promise in chapter 12. We won't look at all the passages, but that he'll be made into a great nation. And we're picking up the story a little bit further on here in Genesis chapter 16, where they've been down to Canaan, they've gone down to Egypt, they've come back out of Egypt, and still no children. And their faith is being tested because the promises have not come true. And sometimes, that's the case. God's timing is not our timing. And so Sarah decides that maybe there's a compromise arrangement that can work. And let's read here from verses 1 to 6. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children." So it's always God's fault. "Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Wow. So, side point, I recommend having only one wife, okay? Top tip. Amen. Hopefully we all agree with that point. But it's easy at our moments when our faith is being tested, when promises haven't been fulfilled, to compromise and take an easy option. And that's what happens here. Abraham and Sarah take their focus off the big things, take their focus off the promise by faith, and they take a shortcut. And that soon leads to conflict, Sarah blames God, Abraham blames Sarah, or rather Sarah blames Abraham. And, there's a lot of conflict suddenly in their family life. And you could argue that it's because Abraham took 2 wives, and I would also agree with that point. But I think there's a wider point that they lost sight of their promise. They lost sight of the passionate faith. They lost sight of the brave decisions that they had made early on in life. And suddenly there was a lot of conflict. And I've noticed that I can be the same. When I'm doing well spiritually, when my eyes are fixed on the prize, I'm an encouraging person to be around. When, things go wrong at home, I smooth them over and I'm an encouraging, faithful dad. When my faith is not fixed on God, then suddenly little things that happen at home become a source of enormous conflict. And I start, moaning and complaining and tearing down my family rather than building my family up. And, even in the church, I think when I'm doing well, when things go wrong, I'm like, okay, what can we do? What does God want to teach us? How can we learn from this? How can we go on? When I'm not doing well, when things don't go right in the church, I nitpick, the font on the slides or, spelling mistakes or other things that annoy me. Which are not actually, central matters of the faith. And, so I think it's good to ask ourselves from time to time, what annoys me? Are you upset over the lostness of the world? That's a big thing, all right? Or are you upset over the fact that your wife didn't make your tea quite the way you like it to be made this morning? Or, whatever your pet peeve might be. It's easy to get carried away. And a couple of questions, what are the topics over which you most have conflict? Jesus had a lot of conflict because he took a stand for what's right in terms of the big things. It's easy for me sometimes to end up in conflict over irrelevant matters, whether it's in the family or at work or in the church. And on it, think about it. How do you need to reconnect with God in order to make sure you're focusing on the most important things? Thirdly and finally, we should renew our faith through worship. When I started reading through the story of Abraham, I thought, well, what was it that enabled him to remain faithful through all the ups and downs that he experienced? And as I read through, I came across these passages. In chapter 12, it says from there he went towards the hills east of Bethel, pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. And that's when he sort of first arrived in the promised land. Then later on, chapter 13, he went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron and pitched his tents. Abraham was a very intense guy. There he built an altar to the Lord. And everywhere he went, he wanted to worship and to honor God by where he lived and by how he lived. And then this is the most powerful for me. Genesis 22, by this point, Abraham, he's now Abraham, rather than Abraham. He's been given his new name, and he's been given the son of the promise, the son of faith, Isaac. And God comes to him and asks him to sacrifice your son, your only son, whom you love. And he decides to go off. He gets up early in the morning, travels on with his servants, and then it says to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back." You know, he sets his heart to go out and worship, and he says, by faith, we will come back. And that really moves me, you know, knowing that, you know, his family was on the line, and his son, his only son whom he loved, his life was at risk, and yet he believed by faith that God would give Isaac back to him, that Isaac could raise him from the dead, we learn in the New Testament. And, you know, his focus was on the worship. You know, we're going to go and worship. I'm going to give what I need to give to God. I'm going to pour out everything, even my most precious things, and I trust that God's going to protect me, and God's going to bring us back to a safe place. And that's easy to say when everything's going well. It's very hard to say when you're being asked to give up your most precious thing, or when things are going terribly in your life rather than amazing in your life. And certainly for Rhoda and I, the last year has been very challenging because our middle daughter's faith is something that was so precious to us, and for that to be, for her not to be doing well spiritually is so challenging for us. And I can remember coming back from spending, the first night that she shared her, changing convictions. It was the evening of my 50th birthday, what should have been, a very happy day in my life, suddenly became a very distressing day. And so I came back to Rhoda, and after Izzy and I had been chatting for hours, and I felt like I'd got nowhere at all. And I said, as I was walking back, I realized, okay, I've been 100% focused on my conversation with Izzy, and now I need to talk to Rhoda, I need to talk to Toby, I need to talk to the rest of the family. And I realized, okay, well, I need to be strong. I need to be there for my family. And I sat down with Rhoda and I said, I choose to have faith. And, I was reminded by Romans chapter 4, where talking of Abraham, it says, without weakening in his faith, in verse 19, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, yet he didn't waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had the power to do what he had promised. I don't claim that I didn't waver through unbelief, because I certainly have done. But it's inspiring to see Abraham and Sarah, going through the challenges in their lives and deciding that despite the circumstances which are so difficult for them, that they would decide to have faith. And the fact that Abraham was willing to go to connect with God, to worship, in order to strengthen and renew his faith from the inside, that gave him the strength to renew his faith and to be able to remain focused on the dreams and plans that God had given him. And so I'd like to ask you, what steps do you want to take to renew your faith in worship? For you personally, for your family, if you're a part of a family, how are you going to renew your faith in worship? And are there dreams that you want to resurrect, to renew, or allow God to reshape, to bring him glory? Are you prepared to make the sacrifices that Abraham was prepared to make in order to see those dreams come true? For Abraham, worship was not just singing. Singing certainly is worship. I love the worship we have at church. But the definition of worship in the Bible is so much greater than that. And Abraham saw, offering his son as an act of spiritual worship. We read from the New Testament that offering our lives as living sacrifices is an act of spiritual worship. So having that worshipful attitude of being poured out like a drink offering, as Paul says in Philippians 2, is a wonderful act of worship, and through which our faith can be renewed. So in conclusion, I'd like to read from Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 is the sort of Hall of Fame of faith, and as a London church, and as I believe you as well are doing, we're talking a lot about faith this year. And in Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 8, It says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. My life often feels like that. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Abraham lived in tents. He didn't have a fixed place to call home. He moved around. He gave up, perhaps, the 2-story building that he had come from in Ur, archaeologically. But it says he was looking forward to a city with foundations. Not just a building, but a city. He had a faithful vision of a spiritual kingdom. And if you read in Revelation 22 about the coming of the New Jerusalem, it talks about a city with 24 foundations. The Old Testament tribes and the New Testament prophets, New Testament apostles, the 24, the symbols of 12 and 12 from the Old and the New Testament. It's the fulfillment of the promises of Abraham that generations and generations, more than the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore, will come together into a home whose architect is God, rather than a place here on earth. And it's good to be reminded that this earth, wonderful though it is a temporary place. And we're called to be children of faith who, like Abraham, look forward to a heavenly city. So, I see in this passage the 3 points we've talked about. Abraham obeyed God and went, even when it wasn't completely clear what that meant. He didn't stop halfway. He had his ups and downs, but he kept his focus on the most important things and didn't let his squabbles take him off track. And thirdly, he renewed his faith in worship, looking forward to that city with foundations. So I hope there's at least one of these 3 points is helpful to you today, and perhaps something that you can take away and make a decision on that will help you, like Abraham and like Sarah, to live passionate lives of faithful fulfillment. Amen.
Thank you.